experiencing the reality of climate change as we speak. I think it's worth noting that because actually 3 days ago there was another part of the world that had a similar unprecedented flood, which has been almost entirely forgotten, which is in South Africa, where about 60,000 people are currently without electricity, 1,000 or so people have had to evacuate their homes, and several dozen people have lost their lives. And I think it's worth always remembering at meetings on climate justice that when we talk about disaster and we think about disaster, the way it's portrayed and talked about by politicians and by the media will reflect the prejudices and the realities of the system that we live in. White people in affluent countries will get more airtime than poor black people in the global south. And that reality is going to become appalling for millions of people. The United Nations themselves say that there are 3.6 billion people, it's a figure I use all the time because it is so stark, 3.6 billion people who live in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change. That's half the world's population. Almost all of them live in coastal floodplains. Those people will be forced by climate change in the next 2-3 decades or so to flee their homes. They'll be met with racism, barbed wire, machine guns, all the sort of apparatus of a racist state like the British government is. And almost all of those people are black and in the global south. Not all of them, but almost all of them are. But it's also true that the people who will suffer most in New York at the moment will be poor working class people. The people who haven't got the ability to leave their homes, go to somewhere else. We saw it in New Orleans 15 or so years ago. And that is why the Tory retreat on net zero the last week is so appalling, really. Because even though we shouldn't have any illusions that net zero from the Tory party means anything serious, it's an example of how little they care about millions of people around the world, how little they care. And they're prepared to backtrack and wind down on the back of pressure from big business, on a desire to win a few hundred votes in some marginal constituencies, and bowing down to the Daily Mail and so on. So when they give the go-ahead to Rosebank, they say they're doing it for the interests of the country, the nation. Actually what they're doing is they're condemning people to death. And I said, and I want to make this clear because I think the trade union movement can be a bit weak on this sometimes. When we say that we have to be critical of net zero, we have to be critical of a vision of net zero, which essentially is the Tory government saying capitalism can solve the problem that capitalism is crisis. We'll have a few financial accountancy tricks and we'll buy off and we'll trade away some carbon and it'll all be right. We know that's not enough. What we need is fundamental change to how our economy is organised and its priorities. And that's why I think that the second tragedy really is that we've got an opposition that follows them down this path. Every time the British Tory government retreats around the environment or gives the go-ahead to an oil exploration in the North Sea, that unfortunately Keir Starmer or someone in his shadow cabinet will come along and say, well, that's business really, we have to do it, we have to accept these things, and that we can't cancel the contracts once we've given them. Because essentially what that means is Labour will also be condemning millions of people to death in a warming world and so on. And I think that rather than refusing to cancel these sorts of contracts, the incoming Labour government should scrap them. It should actually say there's not going to be any new oil or gas from the North Sea. That actually Rosebank is going to be shut down and cancelled. And I should also say at this point, because I am criticising Keir Starmer, I think it's a tragedy that he would attack Just Stop Oil. Because while I may have slight differences in tactics, I think the fact that Just Stop Oil is on the front line, standing up, arguing that something has to be driven, is powerful and it's important. I'll return to that in a moment. And I also think it's a real tragedy that sections of our trade union movement are going down the same path. Elaine mentioned this earlier on, but particularly the GMB and Unite, and particularly the GMB, I think, are backing the wrong course. Because what they are essentially arguing, Gary Smith and the GMB is very open about this, is that the problems for working class communities, austerity and poverty and unemployment and underemployment and so on, are caused because of the reduction of carbon emissions. I don't think that's true. I think what's responsible for the appalling reality of many working class communities is austerity. 10, 15 years of attacks on public services, on jobs, on conditions and pay. I'd like to see Ken Loach's new film last night, The Old Oak. He makes it very, very explicitly clear. The problem for working class communities, the length and breadth of this country, is what's been done to them by rich billionaire governments, and it's not the result of people building wind farms in the North Sea. And I think that we have to point out, as an environmental movement, as a left movement, as a trade union movement, the alternative. We have to say it's entirely possible to build a sustainable green economy that creates jobs, that creates good jobs, high-paid jobs, jobs that are for the long term, and we have to fight for that just transition. And that means that we have to build a movement that thinks and articulates some of these arguments, that explores some of the reality. I mean, I helped write the Climate Jobs booklet, on sale at the end if you want a copy, for the campaign against climate change, make it very, very clear that you can have a sustainable economy in the UK that is about full employment and is not about reducing working class living standards in any way. And that means, I think, linking the environmental movement and the climate justice movement together with the trade union movement, the left, and all the other struggles and fights that there are for equality and freedom and justice in the world and the world today. But I also think we have to find a way, if we're not going to lose millions of people to Tory propaganda, of making working class people feel part of that struggle. So I think it's absolutely important that Just Stop Oil are out there blocking roads and taking brave actions and clogging up the courts and so on. And fair play and solidarity to every single one of the movement that do that. But we also need places where working class people can come and feel comfortable. We need mass demonstrations. I think when we look back to the height of the environmental movement back in 2019, what was the great points? The great points were when Extinction Rebellion and the climate strikes were able to put tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets, united together. And within that mass movement, we were able to take direct action, radical action, as well as ordinary people feeling part of that. And we need to return to that. We can't just leave it to a few brave individuals blocking a particular road. We need a mass movement that incorporates those people as well. The final thing as well is that movement has to have a vision. It has to have a vision that says we want a sustainable world, but that we're also going to challenge the big corporations, the big oil companies, the big business that have caused this problem, will continue to cause it. Unless that is part of our movement, I think we'll doom ourselves along with millions of other people. So good luck to everyone. Let's build that sort of movement, a movement of unity, a movement of solidarity, but a movement that's radical and prepared to take on the real culprits. Thank you.